Welcome. We are about to begin a very extensive examination of some materials that were shared with us, and they concern one of the most frustrating and genuinely baffling cold cases of recent history.
That's right. We're talking about the 1999 death of Ricky McCormick.
Exactly. And our goal today is to go beyond just the simple summary of the facts. We want to really explore the paradoxes that are just so inherent in this case.
There are so many of them.
We'll need to analyze the very few known facts about the victim and the circumstances of his death. But I think more importantly, we have to dedicate some serious time to understanding why two simple pages of scrawled, coded text found in his pockets are still considered the absolute central point to solving this homicide, even now more than 2 decades later.
It's a tragedy that's sort of overlaid with this impenetrable mystery. The situation of Ricky McCormick's death in June 1999 in Missouri is, it's immediately heartbreaking.
It is.
But the enduring puzzle is completely encapsulated in those two cryptic, handwritten notes. They're not just some peculiar piece of trivia in the case file.
No.
They are the single most important piece of physical evidence the investigation has. I mean, if you take the notes out of the equation, the case has virtually no forensic path forward.
And the high stakes of this document are defined very, very clearly by the professionals who were tasked with solving it. According to the research we have, a man named Dan Olson, who was the chief of the FBI's Elite Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, the CRRU.
A serious title.
A very serious title. He stated that cracking this code, and I'm quoting here, could reveal the victim's whereabouts before his death and could lead to the solution of a homicide.
And that statement right there, that tells you everything you need to know about the weight those 2 pages carry.
Absolutely.
For you, the listener, you have to understand that this is so far from just an academic exercise. This is a practical, active, investigative tool. The FBI fundamentally believes that the solution to this man's death is written down, just waiting to be read.
If those notes detail his movements, or maybe even identify his killer,
Then the inability to decipher them is the reason the entire investigation has been stalled for, 25 years now?
yeah.
We're dealing with a homicide where the only substantial lead is locked away in a private, unreadable language.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this incredibly difficult situation. I think we should start with the man himself and the immediate circumstances of the discovery while, trying to maintain the respectful analysis that's due to a life that ended so abruptly and tragically.
Of course.
So, Ricky C. McCormick, he was born on June 14th, 1958, and his estimated time of death places it somewhere between June 25th and June 28th, 1999. That would have made him 41 years old.
Just 41.
And when we look into his background, the sources we have show a life that was really marked by some significant difficulties and instability. He was a high school dropout, which, in itself might suggest some early educational challenges.
Right.
And he was frequently unemployed. At the time of his death, he was receiving disability welfare payments, and that was largely due to chronic and pretty serious health problems, specifically heart and lung conditions.
It is so crucial to establish the reality of his existence here. He wasn't navigating a secure, stable life.
Not at all. He lived intermittently with his elderly mother. He moved around a lot within the greater St. Louis area. And understanding that unstable context is absolutely necessary because it really informs the complexity of trying to find a motive or even just tracking his final movements.
That makes sense.
The sources also provide some details about his personal life. He was unmarried but had fathered at least 4 children. His history also included a criminal record. He'd previously served an 11-month sentence for statutory rape.
And that detail, which is provided in his official profile, is part of the context the police would have had to use, right? To track his associations, even if it's a painful thing to recount.
Exactly. We detail this not as a judgment of his character, but simply because, in a cold case with no clear motive, all the biographical details, his health, his past associates, they all become potential investigative pathways. That's a really important point. The reality of his financial situation and his health status makes the immediate circumstances of the discovery of his body even more bewildering.
And immediately suspicious.
Yes, immediately suspicious. It raises these enormous questions that investigators have just never been able to resolve.
So let's focus really intensely on that discovery. McCormick's body, which was partially decomposed, was found on June 30th, 1999. So that's about 5 days or so after he was last seen alive.
And the location.
The location was a remote cornfield near West Alton, Missouri. It was found by a woman who was driving along a seldom-used field road near Route 367.
So late June in Missouri, the heat, the humidity, That must have contributed to the decomposition.
Oh, absolutely, which complicated the investigation right from the very start. But it was the geography, the exact location, that introduced what investigators would immediately call the spatial mystery of the case.
And that spatial puzzle is where we have to spend some time because it immediately implicates a third party, doesn't it?
It has to.
His body was found approximately 15 miles. That's about 24 kilometers away from his most recent address in the greater St. Louis area.
15 miles. That distance is so much more than just a geographical displacement. It's an investigative barrier.
Right.
You have to consider McCormick's circumstances. The sources state this explicitly. He did not own a car.
No car.
And on top of that, the location where he was found, this cornfield near West Alton, it's a relatively isolated rural area. It was not serviced by public transportation back in 1999.
So the central, inescapable question that must have stalled the investigation right away is how? How did Ricky McCormick, a man with significant chronic heart and lung problems who didn't drive and relied on welfare payments, travel 15 miles to an isolated rural cornfield?
It's the question.
This single fact just fundamentally shifts the focus of the investigation away from accidental death or suicide and directly toward the involvement of someone else. He couldn't have walked that distance. Not with his health issues. It just screams of an intermediary, doesn't it? Someone or something transported him to that isolated spot, likely after he was already injured or deceased.
It compels the investigators to start looking for vehicles and drivers. It means they had to dedicate substantial resources just to solve that transportation gap.
Reviewing who might have seen a car, maybe matching a certain description?
Yes, or who had access to that cornfield road, which was largely private or agricultural land. If they could solve the transportation, they might solve the murder. It immediately connects that spatial anomaly to a probable perpetrator.
And we have to place this all within the timeline. He was last seen alive just 5 days earlier, on June 25th, 1999.
Right.
He was at the now-defunct Forest Park Hospital in St. Louis for a checkup. That short window of time is incredibly frustrating.
5 days is enough time for almost anything to happen, but it's also too short for people to really start asking questions or, filing missing person report.
Which is exactly what didn't happen.
The fact that he hadn't been reported missing is another layer of tragedy and investigative complication. The authorities were able to identify the body pretty quickly using fingerprints.
Which they had to do because of the decomposition.
Right. But that proactive identification meant the police were starting from absolute zero. They didn't have a family member or a friend filing a report and helping establish his routine, his contacts, or his last known location outside of that hospital visit.
So from the very beginning, the investigation faced a wall of challenges. They had a deceased victim, identified through fingerprints, found 15 miles from his home, who was seemingly moved by someone else, and no one had even reported him missing.
And then came the ultimate complication. The inability to establish a clear cause of death or even a motive.
Of course.
When a body is partially decomposed, it's very difficult for forensic pathologists to find definitive signs of trauma. Toxicology becomes challenging, and the window for an accurate time of death estimation just narrows and narrows.
So even though they treated it as a possible homicide because of the location and the transportation gap.
They did, but without a determined cause of death, they lacked the immediate, tangible forensic evidence that can build a case. No specific weapon, no type of injury to track back to a known method.
Which means the entire investigation, right from the start, had to rely solely on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony.
Which they lacked, given the location.
And any personal effects that were found with the victim.
And that's exactly where the focus shifted entirely. When they processed the scene, they found items in his pockets. The contents would have likely been standard things. Maybe a few dollars, some ID, and then those 2 pages of handwritten notes. The absence of a clear cause of death, a known motive, or a suspect profile. Those 2 pages instantly became the most tangible, the most personal evidence they had. They became the investigative choke point, which led directly into an impenetrable wall of code.
And that moves us directly to the central mystery of this case. The evidence that has just defied any solution for decades.
The unbreakable code?
So when these 2 handwritten notes were discovered in McCormick's pockets, they were immediately flagged as crucial and handed right over to the FBI. Can you describe what the notes physically looked like based on the information we have?
Yeah, the sources describe them as consisting of, and this is a quote, a jumble of letters and numbers occasionally set off with parentheses.
A jumble.
Visually, they just appear nonsensical to the untrained eye. They look like a very long, garbled sequence of characters. There are about 30 lines on each page, and they contain a dizzying sequence of 398 characters in total.
And the assumption that investigators made early on, and they've maintained this assumption,
Is that they were written by McCormick himself.
yeah,
That they contain some form of critical information, maybe related to his immediate past, his final movements, or details about the people he encountered just before he died.
that composition, that specific jumble of letters and numbers combined with the parentheses, it suggests something highly non-standard.
It really does.
If it were a simple letter substitution, something like a Caesar cipher, the FBI would have cracked it almost instantly.
In their sleep, probably, yeah.
So this complexity is why the FBI had to deploy its most specialized resources.
Exactly. And this is where we need to really understand the profound technical difficulty here. The notes were submitted to the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, the CRRU.
Okay.
It's important to clarify what the CRRU actually does. They are the federal government's experts. They're dedicated to deciphering coded messages, usually those they encounter in organized crime, narcotics, racketeering.
So structured criminal enterprises that often use established codes or ciphers to hide their communications.
Precisely. The CRRU relies on these highly sophisticated techniques that are rooted in mathematics, computer analysis, and linguistics. So if a criminal organization uses the standard Visionaire cipher, for example, the CRRU would likely solve it pretty quickly using established methods like frequency analysis.
Right. Frequency analysis, that's the backbone of cracking codes. In standard English text, certain letters E, T, A, O, they occur at predictable frequencies.
Exactly.
So if a cipher maintains that frequency pattern, a cryptanalyst can just substitute letters until a readable message appears.
Right. And the fact that the McCormick notes resisted this immediately suggests several possibilities, all of which point to a non-standard or maybe even an invented system.
The numbers, the
The
parentheses.
introduction of random numbers interspersed with letters and then the use of parentheses that break up the flow. That immediately throws traditional frequency analysis right out the window. It disrupts the linguistic patterns that are necessary for standard cracking methods.
So it's not just a simple cipher based on the English alphabet. It's some kind of language hybrid that seems almost intentionally designed to confuse systems that are based on typical linguistic patterns.
It creates a major data deficit for the analysts. If the numbers represent specific actions, or places, or dates, or if the parentheses are markers for shifts in the code key, the cryptanalyst has no starting point unless they know the key or the system.
And the CRU spent years on this.
Years. They spent years attempting to decipher the messages using their internal resources, trying every known cryptographic technique in their arsenal. And all their attempts failed. That failure alone is a profound statement about the uniqueness of this code.
And their failure was so pronounced that they eventually had to look beyond the Bureau itself. They had to seek external validation that this was genuinely unsolvable by conventional means.
They did. The FBI engaged the American Cryptogram Association, the ACA.
Okay, and who are they?
This is a highly respected, well-known group of civilian code specialists. You've got enthusiasts, academics, retired professionals, people who just thrive on complex, unsolved ciphers. The ACA boasts members who have successfully cracked historical codes that professional agencies couldn't touch.
So you have the combined expertise of top government cryptologists working alongside seasoned independent experts.
And they failed. Completely. They failed to decipher any meaning from the McCormick notes.
The failure of the ACA is incredibly significant. That's a detail that you, the listener, really need to focus on. If this elite civilian group, which operates largely outside the bureaucracy and standard protocols of government agencies, can't find a pattern,
It strongly suggests the code is not rooted in traditional cryptographic history.
it has to be something else.
It forces us to consider that it must be either exceptionally complex, maybe a custom cipher that changes keys frequently, or perhaps more provocatively, that it's not a code in the conventional sense at all. And that failure is what solidified the note's status.
And the current status of the investigation just reflects this complete stalemate. The Ricky McCormick notes are explicitly listed as one of the CRRU's top unsolved cases.
Right alongside things like the Zodiac Killer's ciphers.
Exactly, highlighting their unusual complexity and, more ominously, their complete resistance to every established method that's been thrown at them.
And the significance, as the FBI has always stressed, is that the content is tied directly to an active homicide file. If the police cannot read the victim's last known communication, they cannot move forward.
The messages are believed to possibly lead directly to those responsible for the killing.
But they are sealed behind a cryptographic barrier that professional analysis has just not been able to penetrate. The documents themselves are the single largest reason the case remains cold.
This complete roadblock, this decades-long frustration, it brings us to a major point of conflict in the case and a significant delay in the investigation's public timeline. Because we have the official position that these notes are the key, but we also have the victim's own family who insists emphatically that he couldn't possibly have written them.
Which is just a stunning contradiction.
It really is. So let's discuss this profound contradiction presented in the sources. The investigation positions the notes as Ricky McCormick's critical final message, a deliberate clue.
Right.
But years later, specifically in 2012 when the case got renewed public attention, his family members stepped forward and they strongly questioned the foundational premise that Ricky McCormick had the capacity to create or even maintain a coded language system.
And that creates an immediate and really an irreconcilable tension at the heart of the evidence. We have conflicting information about the authorship and the very nature of the primary physical evidence.
If the family is right,
then the entire investigative premise of the FBI is based on a mistaken assumption.
And the family statements were so direct. His mother, Frankie Sparks, she stated with incredible clarity that, quote, the only thing he could write was his name. He didn't write in no code.
Yeah.
And his cousin, Charles McCormick, he underscored this even more, saying Ricky couldn't spell anything, just scribble.
That moves the analysis away from pure cryptanalysis and into, well, forensics and context. If we accept the family's account of his literacy level, that he was functionally illiterate, that he was unable to spell or construct coherent sentences beyond his name, then the notes, which are visually structured and contain hundreds of characters, they become profoundly more mysterious.
They do. They imply either a hidden genius or that they were written by someone else entirely. That is the ultimate implication that we have to address. Did he actually write them? If his family is correct, how do we reconcile 2 pages of structured, if nonsensical text with the victim's apparent inability to write?
Well, there are 2 major investigative paths that open up, if you believe the family. Path A. The notes were planted.
Okay.
They were written by an associate or maybe the killer and placed in McCormick's pocket. If they were planted, the notes might serve 2 primary functions. 1, a genuine taunt, meaning the code contains a message the killer wants investigators to figure out, maybe an arrogant clue.
Then the other possibility.
Or, and this is probably more likely, a gross misdirection, something written hastily and intended to consume investigative resources endlessly while providing 0 real information.
And what's path B?
Path B is equally complex. It's that Ricky McCormick did write them, but the family misunderstood his writing process. If he could only scribble, as they said, perhaps this code isn't a formal cipher at all.
But his own idiosyncratic, inconsistent, and highly personalized shorthand.
Exactly, an attempt at language, but one created without the rigor of formal spelling or grammar, meaning only he could have ever interpreted the meaning behind the symbols and numbers.
But the FBI, they maintain their view that the notes are a code, and they continue to pursue the solution aggressively.
They do. And this suggests that they might possess some internal evidence, maybe handwriting analysis that links the script to other known writings of McCormick, or perhaps structural evidence within the jumble itself that they believe outweighs the family's anecdotal claims about his illiteracy.
So for the Bureau, the possibility that the notes are a purposeful code is still the most valuable investigative direction.
It seems to be.
But if the family's assertion about his limited literacy is a forensic fact, I mean, if he genuinely struggled to write, doesn't that fundamentally change the code's expected complexity?
It should.
Wouldn't the FBI need to abandon the idea that it's some sophisticated standard cipher and instead focus on the possibility that it's simply inconsistent?
That's an excellent point. The professional failure of both the CRRU and the ACA suggests the latter might be true. The code fails to be solved because it follows no known rules, precisely because the author may have invented the rules inconsistently on the fly.
So the failure of sophisticated cryptanalysis could be due to 2 things.
Right. Either the cipher is incredibly complex, or it is utterly random and inconsistent. If it's random, it's virtually unsolvable because the key might be changing line by line or even character by character.
So if the FBI is still focused on advanced cryptographic methods,
They might be missing the basic human element of the victim's struggle with communication.
this complexity is then compounded by one of the most puzzling operational elements of the case. the massive information gap and that delayed public appeal.
Yes.
Officials informed the family about the other contents of McCormick's pockets back in 1999, cash, maybe keys or a wallet, but the family only learned about the existence of the coded dreads 12 years later from a local news broadcast.
That 12-year silence it's extraordinary, and it fundamentally shapes the entire case. It means that for over a decade, the only people who knew that the single most critical piece of evidence in a homicide investigation was a coded message were inside the Bureau.
Specifically, inside the CRRU.
Right.
So why? Why such a long delay? Why was this crucial piece of evidence withheld from the public and, more importantly, from the people who knew the victim best, his own family, for so long?
Well, there are logical, if sometimes frustrating reasons why law enforcement agencies exercise that kind of caution. Initially, the CRU would have dedicated significant internal resources to solving the puzzle themselves.
They would have run every decryption program, tested every known method.
Exactly, and compared the notes against their massive library of known criminal ciphers. That process can take years, especially for a non-standard message. The agency wants to exhaust all of its proprietary high-security methods before resorting to a public appeal.
Which is essentially an admission of defeat.
It is. So the delay signals a prolonged internal struggle, not necessarily any malice. It suggests that around 2011 they finally realized they had reached an absolute, complete dead end using their own resources.
And they had to choose. They had to choose between letting the case continue to languish silently or making the unprecedented move of crowdsourcing the solution to a critical homicide clue.
It also reflects a resource allocation challenge. I mean, the CRRU deals with ongoing threats, often related to national security or massive financial crimes. A cold case homicide, even one as intriguing as McCormick's, has to compete for those resources.
So the decision to go public likely meant that a renewed court case review determined that the external risk of releasing the code-like generating millions of useless tips was finally outweighed by the internal failure to solve the murder.
That's most likely what happened. They waited until March 29, 2011, a full 12 years after the body was found, to issue that public appeal. They released the images of the notes and just asked for help.
It was a calculated risk, wasn't it? Essentially asking the entire world to solve a murder that the nation's top codebreakers could not.
The huge risk.
So when the FBI finally released the notes in 2011, the public response was immediate and overwhelming.
It really was.
The 2011 appeal generated what the sources call an outpouring of responses, and it dramatically demonstrated the public's intense fascination with true crime, cold cases, and of course, unsolved ciphers.
It became an international amateur sport overnight. For the public, this was the ultimate challenge, coming straight from the files of the FBI. The sources confirmed the sheer volume of responses was so immense, so immediate, that the FBI was operationally paralyzed for a short time.
I can imagine.
They had to quickly update their guidance, specifically requesting that helpers should not call them by phone or use the general agency email because they were just being flooded with tips.
That moment provides such a fascinating look into the logistical nightmare of high-stakes crowdsourcing.
It really does.
You have a federal law enforcement agency known for its rigorous structure and operational control, and it was momentarily just overwhelmed by an influx of enthusiastic amateur cryptanalysts trying to solve a 12-year-old murder.
It highlights the dual nature of public engagement. On one hand, you potentially gain access to millions of minds, collective brain power. Maybe you find that one person whose unique knowledge base may be related to McCormick's specific slang or his hobbies holds the key.
But on the other hand,
you create an unprecedented data management and filtering crisis. How do you efficiently review thousands of proposed solutions, many of which are based on wishful thinking or just flawed logic?
the FBI's response was really indicative of that challenge. They couldn't just ignore the tips. Every solution, no matter how outlandish it seemed, had to be reviewed and logged.
And potentially checked against a database of known criminal associations or aliases.
Right.
They realized they needed to structure the input, so they established a separate, dedicated page on their website where the public could specifically offer comments, theories, and proposed decipherments of the coded messages.
They were essentially shifting the flow of information.
Exactly. From these uncontrolled, distracting channels like phone lines and general inboxes to a highly structured online format, which allowed investigators to filter and analyze the data more systematically.
And this dedicated comment page, it was an operational necessity, really, for preserving the integrity of the murder investigation. I mean, think about the process. Every solution submitted has to be tested against criteria logged into the official case file.
And potentially cross-referenced with known details about McCormick's life or criminal history, which the public didn't have. The administrative burden of sorting through, authenticating, and testing potentially thousands of suggested solutions is just staggering.
And this connects directly back to the CRU's mission, doesn't it?
Yeah.
While their name focuses on cryptanalysis and racketeering records, this case proves their code-breaking expertise is essential in any homicide where the code itself is the only lead.
They're the gatekeepers. They're the only ones who can verify if a public tip genuinely cracks the code or if it's just a coincidence.
We have to remember the physical nature of the notes, that jumble of letters and numbers occasionally set off with parentheses. This unique structure, not purely alphabetical, not purely numerical, is what defeated the professionals, and it continues to defeat the public. The combination of its complexity, its unique construction, and the lack of a known key is why, despite that huge public effort that was mobilized in 2011, the notes remain one of the top unsolved cases on the CRRU list to this very day.
They've absorbed decades of effort and still yielded absolutely nothing.
So where does that leave us?
When we synthesize all the elements of the Ricky McCormick case, we are left with a series of profound investigative paradoxes, and they all center around those 2 pages of writing.
Okay.
We have a victim discovered 15 miles from his home who was clearly transported there without any means of his own, suggesting foul play.
Right.
Authorities could not establish a definitive cause of death or a motive, which left this massive investigative void. The coded message found in his pocket, which should have been the golden key,
Has defied professional cryptographers for decades.
across decades. And yet, the victim's own family strongly asserts that he was barely literate and lacked the capacity to write such a code in the first place.
So the notes are simultaneously the investigation's only substantial lead and its most durable, frustrating barrier.
Crisis.
It's a case that has captured the public imagination exactly because of that cryptographic barrier. And the public fascination surrounding McCormick's case places it firmly in the category of other famous, historically persistent, unsolved messages that we find referenced in the materials.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
We see profound parallels with the persistent, lingering mystery surrounding the Isdal woman case in Norway.
Where the victim also died under suspicious circumstances.
Yes, and also left behind coded writings that remain opaque to this day. Or the even more baffling Tamam Shud case from Australia, where a body was found with a mysterious scrap of paper torn from a book.
Meaning the solution lay in finding the specific missing copy of that book. It was a contextual puzzle.
Exactly. And of course, the enduring cryptographic challenges posed by the infamous Zodiac killer ciphers.
The key difference in these comparisons, and maybe why the McCormick case is so vexing, is in the nature of the challenge. The Zodiac ciphers were genuine, technically sophisticated challenges rooted in cryptographic history, whereas the Tamam Shud clue was a piece of text ripped from a book, making it, as you said, a contextual puzzle. McCormick's notes seem to sit somewhere in between, too organized to be fully random, yet too inconsistent to be a standard cipher.
Yes. In all these cases, the encrypted message serves not just as evidence, but as the enduring symbol of the mystery itself, and it attracts amateurs and professionals alike. The difficulty in McCormick's case really highlights the specific problem of codes that are either unique, highly personal, or deliberately structured to be non-standard.
They evade the massive computer power and standardized tools that the CRRU usually employs.
Exactly.
And here is where the ultimate question about the notes lies, and it's what we want you, the listener, to continue considering long after this discussion ends. If the notes truly hold the victim's final location, or maybe the killer's identity, and given that physical description, that specific jumble of letters and numbers occasionally set off with parentheses, what if the solution is not a complex traditional cipher that requires advanced mathematical cryptanalysis?
What if we take the family's assertion of his limited literacy seriously? What if, instead of being a highly secure cipher, the note represents a highly personalized system? Perhaps a flawed or shorthand attempt at recording critical information that only McCormick himself was ever intended to understand.
So maybe the numbers refer to specific objects he knew, and the parentheses mark unique abbreviations used only between him and an associate.
It's possible. If the solution is contextual, if the key lies not in cracking the math, but in understanding the specific, potentially chaotic way Ricky McCormick tried to capture language, then the investigation needs to shift focus entirely. The key would be hidden in his unique, idiosyncratic system, not in the rigor of cryptography.
which implies the solution may have been accessible back in 1999 to someone who knew him intimately.
but has become impossibly remote now that he is gone. It means the only way to solve the code is to somehow resurrect the man himself.
Thank you for following this extensive analysis of the materials regarding the Ricky McCormick case. Thanks for listening.